Hello, everyone. John Rosengard with in Oakland, California. Thanks for joining our webinar today on environmental liability watch lists. I'll be running through the following agenda here today. I'll be reviewing specifically a definition of what a watch list is and providing screen captures from a brand new ASTM standard developed in the last 12 months called ASTM E3123-17. Within that new standard are two specific tables that we'll go through in a little detail, which is the pre-recognition environmental liability watch list, which is normally for sites that are early on in the remediation process or early on in the quantification process. Or in other words, a post-construction watch list, which shows again the transition from a pre-remedial to a post-remedial watch list instead of reopeners or concerns. From there, I'll cover the purposes of the watch list, deployment best practices and lessons learned, perhaps some ideas that you can apply this year to your programs, and talk about some of the benefits that we, our clients at the RCI, develop watch lists. Plenty of time for Q&A in this presentation here today. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask as we go forward. A little bit of background on me. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Environmental Risk Communications. I started the company in 1994, so we're coming up on our 24th anniversary. I'm the author of a software tool called Defender, which has environmental liability forecasting, and I've given over 100 speeches and webinars on topics related to specific types of environmental liabilities, like those found in due diligence, asset retirement obligations, remediation liabilities, and so on. I'm also the technical contact for two ASTM standards, and one is ASTM E21. Either the disclosure of environmental liabilities. My term runs another 4 years. So again, if you have any questions, email, call, 15 to 30 minutes. It's on the house. Happy to help you along your journey in figuring out how to improve disclosure and internal presentation of environmental liabilities. It's work that I do find a lot of value in and enjoyment from. So again, it's not an imposition. You're welcome to call anytime. And finally, I'm the technical contact for the next 5 years for E3123. I initiated this activity back in January of 2017, and what we'll be seeing are some screen captures from the standard itself. If you want copies of these two standards, by the way, I highly recommend going right to the source, the ASTM.org website, downloading copies. Your company may already be a subscriber to these standards, or you may have to buy them for $50 to $65 a piece. But I promise you, getting copies straight from the copyright holder is definitely going to be worth it. Each of them are roughly 20 to 30 pages of single-spaced tactical instructions about how to work with environmental liabilities. There's nothing like it in GAAP. There's nothing like it in other presentations that we've seen out there. And again, we think it's a constructive, beneficial tool for improving dialogues inside companies and public agencies that have significant environmental liabilities over, say, $25 million. By way of educational background, I've got an MBA from Northwestern and a bachelor's in business from Georgetown. So two big footnotes. Not an environmental attorney, not a CPA, also not an environmental consultant or engineer. I look at environmental liabilities from a software development, from a management consulting perspective, and from a person who's looked at 4,100 sites over the last 24 years, and before that worked for FMC and Exxon. So I hope that framework is useful background for you. And again, I look forward to connecting with each of you individually if you're new to today's webinar. Let's move on to the definition of an environmental liability watch list. First and foremost, it's a tool to document what's not booked, what's not recognized as an environmental liability today. In other words, it's a leading indicator of what might be booked, what might be set up for spending in the future, but isn't ripe or ready today. So how do you do that? Through identification of a risk that's not booked. A liability is booked, but a risk isn't booked. But you identify a risk specifically that's not in the provision now, and then review how, when, why, and if any circumstances may change. We have specific names for those circumstances that we think will be useful best practices for your team to adopt if it hasn't already. If quantification is in order to kind of get a good framework or rough order of magnitude, cost expectation around a risk, we have a tool for generating ranges of dates, ranges of costs, and if circumstances might or will change. And then we have the possibility of a risk reoccurring many times or just only once, which is unfortunately an artifact of some environmental cleanups. We work with some clients that are on their third, fourth, and fifth cleanups of the very same sites. In some cases, they're different operable units. Sometimes they've been recontaminated. In other cases, the cleanup levels have changed more stringently to where the groundwater pump and treat system was turned off for a while, then had to be reactivated, turned off for another while, reactivated, and so on. The accounting definition of an environmental liability really gives us room for something that we call the book value versus market value gap. And that's a gap in what's called fair value measurement. These are terms not of my making. These are terms that investors are quite aware of, CFOs, controllers are quite aware of. And it was addressed through a Financial Accounting Standards Board statement in 2006. So it's actually been the preferred method of measuring environmental liabilities for 12, 13 years now. What it means is there's an expression at weighted averages, multiple scenarios, applying professional judgment instead of applying a strict filter or screen like there's no estimate, there's a known minimum, or there's a low end of the range. That was common in 1995 to have those other terms, but the gradual progression has been to, as a site matures, as an environmental risk matures, to really convert that into an expected value with a range plus or minus around that. And we'll talk about how to do that later today. The other improvements that we think that are out there are this ASTM standard guides that identify the watch list process out there. All of these standards that I've got listed here, 2137, 2173, and 3123, contain a watch list, contain the same definition, and contain basically the same layout that we're going to cover today. So again, I recommend if you haven't gotten copies of these lately, these were all updated in the last 18 months, get a look at them and see if there are some data gaps for your organization to look at when it looks at policy and budgeting and reserve setting over the 3 to 5 years to come. I'm quite sure that your organization is passing audit today. I'm quite sure that everything that's happening today in your organization is adequate. This is about stepping the game up to improve the program over the years to come and make it, put it in better shape than you found it. So moving forward with our presentation here today, what I'd like to just share that I put some graphics into this to make it maybe a little more visually interesting. And when I talk about environmental liability watch lists, I really come back to one graphical element time and time again, and that's a bullseye. And a bullseye that I've got here really shows the overlapping or concentric circles that make up an environmental liabilities cost over the life cycle, over time. The short-term center focus is that budget. What do you have in short-term spending over the next 6 months to 2 years? It's a very, very short-term focus. The next outer ring is the reserve. Some organizations call it a provision, but it's the liabilities book value. What's set aside on a company's books today? Those two numbers are often quite small relative to what the total liability might be over, say, 10 to 100 years. The next circle around, the light blue circle, is the pre-recognition watch list, and usually that's a multiple of maybe 1 or 2 above the current reserve, just as a rule of thumb. And then there's a post-settlement watch list, which might be much, much smaller than the pre-recognition watch list. But again, those 4 circles together combine to give you market value or fair value measurement. So if a user or any environmental liability forecaster ever conflates those terms, I'd like to come back to this graphic and say, your liability isn't your fair value measurement. If you went into a big merger, acquisition, due diligence study tomorrow, you'd come up with 2 numbers. You'd say, okay, this facility has this booked liability today, but these good things might happen and these other bad things might happen, the net effect of which is the fair value number is going to be different for how we got to price the liabilities in a transaction today. That transaction is called a test of fair market value. or fair value measurement. And so again, keep in mind that if you've worked on due diligence, we're simply applying what you've already seen as experience, and I'm giving labels perhaps to things that you've been working with for quite some time. I hope that's constructive. That's what it's meant to be, not to say that we develop things from scratch in an ASTM standard. We simply put the names that are already out there together into a common, simpler, and more focused reference place. So let's get to the heart of the matter. What is a watch list? What are you here for? I'm happy to explain this because this has been a great tool in explaining environmental liabilities for me for the last 18 years. And I got to give credit where credit's due. One of our larger clients has a major CPA firm evaluating their environmental liabilities several times a year. They found that a form of this didn't have all of these columns and didn't have some other statistical correlation work done behind it. But they got them started on this in 1999. And I found it fascinating to help project managers think through, work through, and document efficiently and effectively where an environmental reserve was for an individual site. And we've looked at, as a company, our team's looked at 4,100 sites. And again, we go back to having communication problems with environmental risks. That's how we named our company, Environmental Risk Communications. Most of the challenge in communicating environmental risk is the financial side. It's communicating the business impact of the environmental issues, the environmental risks. So again, this is a core tool that goes to our company's beliefs as well. But credit where credit is due, the Pricewaterhouse team helping one of our clients really kicked off some of my framework thinking quite some time ago. Moving left to right, let me just show you how this is organized, and I'm going to take my time doing this. If you have any questions, slow me down, please ask. I'll do my best to answer in real time. Column number one is the type of the liability. There are 5 types of environmental liabilities out there specified in generally accepted accounting principles, not our definitions, but Financial Accounting Standards Board definitions, as well as Governmental Accounting Standards Board definitions. These are universal terms. We're simply applying them to this spreadsheet, this table here. Those 5 types are asset retirement obligations, so in other words, end-of-life demolition, decommissioning costs, other environmental obligations like RCRA and CERCLA, Superfund closures, commitments, which are contractual obligations between entities like a lease or a PRP cost sharing agreement, for example, contingencies, which are legal claims normally or cash calls at Superfund sites, and then finally guarantees, which are normally things like financial assurance guarantees, the cost of which is over and above the actual asset retirement work or the remediation work. The cost of the guarantee, which is with low interest rates very, very small these days, is still one of those long-term tails of unique costs that do need to be accounted for a little differently from the ARO itself, the remediation liability itself, and so on. So those are the 5 types. Those 5 types are spelled out in the ASTM standard as well, just for commonality of definition. But again, we're just the messenger. We're identifying the 5 types that are already spelled out by the accountants, for the accountants, and we're simply sharing that with the rest of the user community, whether you're an attorney, an environmental liability project manager, portfolio manager, or other capital steward involved in the auditing process or the financial accounting process. The next step over, column 2, site-specific definition, is more or less a reminder or a framing of what's in scope or maybe out of scope for a specific line item. So an ARO may cover, for example, all the active storage tanks, demolition of a specific building or 2 or 3 or a complex, or handling a specific pipeline. Identifying and tagging an asset is an important part of managing a 5-line, 20-line, or 50-line watch list, because as you put a watch list away at the end of a quarter or the end of the year, someone, maybe you, may have to pick that up in 6 months or a year and say, wait, what was this about? It's meant to be a refresher. So the site-specific definition, not meant to be an A to Z compilation of all of the issues at a site, but meant to trigger the conversation about, oh, this is for the NERDA issue, oh, this is for the off-site migration or the multi-party settlement site. This is not related to X or Y or Z. So again, 2 is supposed to be a framing point. 3 and 4 are the pivotal part of knowledge management in our opinion. Column 3 is there to list past obligating events and recognition benchmarks. I got a whole slide on just what those are. There's actually a little checklist to go through of 10 to 15 items to say, is this liability more probable? That's the obligating event set of questions. And is it more reasonably estimable today than it was yesterday, which are the recognition benchmarks? There are always going to be a mix of things in the past that say, yeah, it's not zero anymore. It's probably going to be something, but we're definitely not at the finish line of definitively determining what that number is. And the next column over is identifying those future obligating events and recognition benchmarks that haven't been triggered yet. Almost every site falls into this pattern where there's a complicated story, there's several recognition benchmarks and obligating events that have been triggered, but it's not time to come up with the perfect single number yet because there are key future obligating events and recognition benchmarks. This clarity in columns 3 and 4 we find is the thinking you can never outsource. You can never just hand this over to an outside expert or just trust an auditor to document it right. This has to be done by the people closest to the liability, the corporate or a public agency project manager who works with the site day in, day out. They'll know the current emails, they'll know the current correspondence, they'll know whether to answer yes or no to specific recognition benchmarks and obligating events. So we think these first 4 columns absolutely pivotal to getting a watch list started. The next 3, if there's enough information, columns 5, 6, and 7 help with that quantification step to say, yeah, we don't have a perfect single number, but we do have these ranges of probabilities around column 5. Will this even happen? Will this future obligating event or recognition benchmark ever even happen? And if so, when? What's our current expectation in column 6? In column 7, what's the range of expected costs? Any user, any person skilled with Excel can take columns 5, 6, and 7 and combine the math together to come up with a range of expected costs. Not complicated. It's roughly a 65-character formula within Excel. Very straightforward. Happy to share it if you're interested in seeing it. But that's the missing column 8, I guess I would call it. But I don't want to really draw too much attention to the intensity of the accuracy of the mathematical calculation. We're trying to convey actually something closer to the opposite, that not everything is worked out. Not everything is finalized to the point where a liability can and should and must be booked today, or should have been booked previously. What we're trying to convey is that lack of precision that we have today. And so the ranges that you see here, the wide range of dates spanning out over decades, the wide range of costs spanning orders of magnitude, the probability of whether or not this future obligating event will even be happening, column 5. We found through trial and error, through lessons learned, best practices, evaluation across many, many, many sites in many, many years, across lots of different types of environmental liability portfolios, that these 7 columns work. Not every space has an answer, but it's good discipline, it's got good utility, and then when you pick this up 12 months, 24 months, 36 months down the road, consistency starts to develop and a portfolio mindset is enhanced over time so that, again, similar liabilities are managed in similar ways. One of the principles you want to go after is everyone is expecting you to manage similar liabilities in similar ways. Manage means spending, management means measuring, management means quantification and articulation of risks too. So in having a similar way of articulating, here's what the risk is, here's what we think about it today, that's the essence of a watch list. Well, let's say that we finished some work, like we've done some demolition or excavation of work, or we've settled a third-party Superfund claim on a sediment site, and we're looking at this liability. We have some progress to report internally over the years that it takes for a project to get executed. So we're headed towards something called a post-settlement watch list. That's our next slide. But to get there, we have to be really in a circular loop of evaluating where our obligating events on the left side of the graphic here and the recognition benchmarks on the right half of the slide, where each of those stand. And what you'll find over time is a site you may start a watch list next month, for a given site and find that 2 of the obligating events have been triggered and maybe only 1 of the recognition benchmarks have been triggered, and that's where you are. And then a few years later, a few more OEs and RBs kick in, and then in 5 years, most of the obligating events and recognition benchmarks have been triggered, and it's time to book a reserve because the numbers have settled down, the timing has settled down, and the probability of a negative financial impact that has settled down too. Yeah, those are the 3 big moving pieces that the watch list summarizes: is the cost settling down? Is the timing settling down? Is the probability of occurrence settling down? Those columns 5, 6, and 7 we just looked at. The definitions that I've got here, which are these 9 obligating events and 12 recognition benchmarks, these are pulled from corporate policies we've looked through, worked with, helped edit, helped improve. Also, it's from generally accepted accounting principles. There's a document called GASB 49, GASB Statement 49 from the Governmental Accounting Standards Board in 2005, 2006. They were the first to articulate these ideas as points where a liability would be reevaluated for recognition, or risk would be repriced or revalued for recognition on a company's books. So I give credit where credit is due. It was written by accountants for accountants, and we're simply passing this along in a more enhanced format to, again, help with communicating that we know more than zero, that we have something more than nothing to work with. We've got something that put this issue or property or a liability or risk rather on our radar, but we don't have enough to come up with a definitive final number to budget and to reserve for. So again, these terms are listed in ASTM 3123, section 6.1 for the obligating events, 6.2 for the recognition benchmarks, and I again encourage you to get a look at. This is just a half a page of a 25-page standard on how to recognize and derecognize environmental liabilities. So again, I encourage you to take a more in-depth look if this is of interest for further adoption. Once we've done work in the field, we move on to what's called a post-settlement watch list. And what you'll see is this is the same structure that we had for the pre-recognition watch list, only we're working now with the assumption that the work's been done. The major work that we're going to do in the field, like excavating soil, demolishing a building, paying off a multi-party settlement site claim to a PRP group, that those steps have occurred. And the big thing that's changed, column 5, the probability of a future obligated event or recognition benchmark occurring. Now, remember from the previous watch list, we had events that were 25, 75, 100% probability of happening. And here you see the probability of just the reopeners. Will we have to come back to the table? Will we have to redo more work? Will there be another phase? Sometimes that probability is high, but normally what an external reviewer like me would look for is that these probabilities of future risks turning into liabilities that have to be booked, that probability is just collapsed because of the work that was done, because of the settlement that was achieved. That's just the routine logic. Also, you'll find in column 6, maybe the time frames are even longer, like, in 100 years, we might have to go out and reinvestigate an off-site receptor or another environmental asset, like our groundwater table below our site. Perfectly normal. Bracketing those costs with much lower numbers, like $50K for a site assessment, $1 million to put in monitoring wells and monitor that for 5 to 10 years. Those rough order of magnitude costs give a sense with, again, the probability of will it happen and the long-term duration of whether that will be needed. Gives a sense that the present value of that line item is quite small. It's correspondingly in the $1,000 to $100,000 range, immaterial to the measure of most any public agency and corporation out there managing environmental liabilities today. And that's the point. This is a communication tool to say we're not out of the woods entirely, but we're doing fine. We've reduced this liability as much as we can. We've accomplished, in other words, what spending can accomplish, And that's where we're at today. We haven't resolved every single teeny tiny risk, but the ones that we have are de minimis, residual, under control, manageable, and they're extremely long term. So they don't deserve acute attention. You may note as well that column 3, the past obligating events and recognition benchmarks make up for a really good knowledge management setup to just say, well, this was the chronology. It took us 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to get to this point where we could settle out this liability. It took a long time. It didn't come up on us overnight. It took a while to negotiate, to settle, to do the field work, and get regulatory and community endorsement. But that's where we wound up, and that's where we are leaving a given project today and deactivating the project, deactivating the charge code perhaps in our cost accounting system, and leaving it where it is. That column 4, though, is always interesting to me. What could be the possible reopeners? You always have the risk of new, more stringent cleanup goals, new receptors, new discoveries of plumes off-site, new spills. You always have that risk. So this can be, again, boilerplate and overkill, but again, if there's quality thinking here, it's a useful learning tool over the years and decades to come. And keep in mind, your organization has probably already been managing remediation liabilities for 20 plus years. If no one's told you the bad news, you should probably count on another 20 to 40 years more of the same sort of slow incremental inflow of future projects due to mergers, acquisitions, new spills, and so on. Again, if you'd like to see a copy of this, this is a part of ASTM 3123, and this is actually table number 2. And it's got associated narrative about how to fill it out in, I think, a page or 2 worth of instructional detail. This is an example of what that guidance looks like. I apologize for the size of the font here, but I just want to show you that the ASTM standard 3123 does provide that column by column instruction of how to fill it out, how to use it. This is, again, part of what makes up a 25-page explanation of best practices and lessons learned from our work group's perspective. And our work group that developed 3123, we were 29 members strong. I was the initiator of the activity, the discussion leader, the sponsor of the topic and the standard. But we got unanimous ballots when we voted among the membership of ASTM's E50 committee and our subcommittee on risk management. We got unanimous ballots because we really felt like we had, again, I think a good state-of-the-art understanding. We'll be improving it over time. We'll be redressing questions and making it better as best we can in future iterations. But for having nothing last year to having a 25-page single-space standard, we think this does represent some useful compendiums, useful compilations of good ideas. Again, for a better, more readable version, please take a look at the PDF, and then please go to the ASTM.org website and figure out how to get your copy of the standard online. They're the official copyright holder of the, I was a contributor to the standard along with 28 other members, but they're the official copyright holder. Any current version of this ASTM standard you should be getting from directly from the ASTM.org website. Being a sort of a software-oriented or math-oriented person, there are some specific advancements that I got in mind for using a watch list productively in more complex situations like new $50 million environmental liability portfolios that come in from acquisitions or as a result of a spinoff or something like that. And I like to look at these 4 things as maybe added layers of making sure that the overall balance of the watch list is accurate. Not the individual line item is perfect, but that directionally that number is accurate to within 10 to 50% given some circumstances. Number 1 is correlating the cost. Will that cost even occur with the inevitability, the probability of will it happen? Sometimes if you do say like you can say articulate an explanation and say, well, there's a 50-50 chance it'll be at least $1 million, but there's almost no chance it'll be 10 million. Well, there's a sliding scale on both sides. The higher the dollar value, the lower the probability. That's called a negative correlation. So it's that correlation that I find is a useful part of getting the valuations across the line items done properly as well. Because if you look at that second item of key cost inputs, moving up and down a bunch of sites at the same time. If they're heavy earthwork projects, those sites are going to move up and down with the cost of diesel fuel. They're going to go up and down with the probabilities of other things as well, like does this remedy work on the mix of contaminants we've got? Sometimes the answer is a resounding yes. If you dig it up and put it in a truck, it will go to another location and that will work. But there are other technologies that have less than 100% success rates, and that there are some that are just in the experimental stage, and we're still learning, and that's normal. But as we're going to be innovating and learning about different ways of cleaning up soil, groundwater, and sediments, we're going to be seeing that those probabilities will be not static and stable, but will be dynamic and evolving as different factors come into play. And that'll affect more than one site at more than one time. Another thing that we find is a useful variable is for the multi-party site portfolios. If your organization is involved in a lot of Superfund sites, the probability of certain counterparties making it to the end of the life cycle, making it to 10 or 100 years out when regulatory closure is achieved, that's a tough Darwinian factor of time. Not every organization is built to last 100 years, 200 years, and so on. In fact, the mortality rate is actually pretty aggressive. There's a formal set of numbers that come out periodically about the rate of bankruptcy in the U.S., but as a rule of thumb, my experience is that companies dissolve at the rate of around 7% a year. So sometimes successors and assigns works there to pass on the liability within a family of companies, but the sheer bankruptcy rate for companies like General Motors and Enron going into bankruptcy, to cite a couple of examples, and stranding environmental liabilities of their other PRPs, that's around 1.6% a year, and that's good times and bad times. We actually track counterparties for some PRP groups, and that's borne out by hard data as well as some hard-won experience about getting letters of credit before an organization gets to their weakest possible point and has to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy or reorganization or Chapter 7 liquidation. The other two types of correlation or calculations rather that we look at are the correlation among liability types, like if you spend more on asset retirement, will you spend less on commitments or remediation liabilities? And if you spend more on AROs, will you spend more on financial assurance guarantees to promise that you'll do the work 10, 50, 100 years from now? And then finally, is there correlation among sites based on some attributes like, is there 1,4-dioxane, PFOA, or PFOS? Or are these sites all located in a similar geographic area and would fall under a regulatory regime that's evolving like New Jersey's licensed site remediation program? So those are the advanced calculations that we think of for looking at perfecting a watch list. It's not useful for a full portfolio every 90 days or for a once-a-year checkup, but it could be one of those clarification points of getting a number, getting a portfolio value that's accurate within 25% to getting it to be accurate within 10%. It's these kind of fine points. So again, I say that not every situation derives value from that degree of accuracy, but strategic transactions like mergers and acquisitions, due diligence activities, often become those critical points where I'm sure each of you are involved respectively in your organizations, and you will again find utility from dusting off a watch list and doing these advanced calculation steps as well. Just to again remind you about the liability life cycle, the way we see it expressed in GAAP is there's a preference for identifying risks before they become liabilities. In other words, developing an internal heads up, not for disclosure, but for internal presentation to give warning to some future reserve charges, not coming up the very day that they're inescapable, but to instead gradually show the progression of learning. Everything that you would read in FASB and GASB standards say there's always a lot of moving parts in environmental liabilities. You never know everything, but you also know more than zero today. And so you're on this continuum, this spectrum, this gradation of from knowing very, very little to knowing absolutely everything you need to know to book a liability. And as you gradually move, when you normally gradually move in a linear direction toward more knowledge, more information, and toward converting a risk into a booked liability, you go through this cycle where you start something on the watch list, you go over to the lower right, to the right side, to recognition, where you accrue for a liability. You then eventually get to the budgeting stage where you settle with work or spending or negotiations. And then you complete the very, very brief step of derecognition and extinguishment of the liability after it's been settled, which is a simpler term for turning off a charge code and deactivating the files and archiving information that you've got, and reassigning a project manager to more active environmental liabilities. And then the cycle begins anew because you'll have a post-settlement watch list item of some residual things that may reopen, and that goes again back to the master watch list for the full site or ultimately the full portfolio. So just to move forward into our presentation here, what are the purposes of the watch list? Again, just to sum up, it explains what isn't in the reserve, or if your company uses the term provision, what isn't in the provision today, what isn't on the books now, and explain why, and explain what future obligating events or recognition benchmarks have not yet happened today. You may think that's intuitive, natural, like we haven't been given regulatory approval to go into the field and implement a remedy. That may be something only you know. That may be something that only a portfolio manager and a project manager know. An auditor isn't going to figure that out or Google that. They're going to need an explicit statement to say, sometime in the next 3 to 5 years, just a guess, we're going to have a remedy approved by a regulator. It could be $1 million to $10 million, 95% chance it'll happen, but that's our best assessment of what it is today, and that's why it's not booked today, because the regulator hasn't said, go do X. We're still working with a range of options today. So that's again, one way of making the thinking process visible, that it may only be communicated via emails or shared in a common council's presentation or a project status update that doesn't delve into enough detail to track success and future events accurately. What you're trying to do in making your thinking process visible about your future events is talk about what you know versus what you think versus what you hope. This is called a compliance assurance continuum, where the weakest point that you're at is what you hope is right. The next step up is what you think is right, and the final step is what you know is right. Differentiating between what you hope versus think versus know, very, very important in business, of course. The watch list helps you do that. Explains, like, this is what I hope is right, this is what I think is right, and then these past obligating events and recognition benchmarks, this is what I know is right. This has already happened. So again, when you get that thinking process made clear, made visible, on how a risk is transitioning into a booked liability, you talk about the range of costs, the timing, and will that future event even happen? Again, columns 5, 6, and 7 of the watch list itself. Why are you doing this? Well, step back for a second. You're not doing this to comply with general accepted accounting principles or to make me happy or to keep yourself busy. You're doing this because your business needs it. Your public agency needs this. You need this. You need to periodically provide proof that you're storing your institutional knowledge. You're documenting what you hope for the site, and you're measuring similar risks in similar ways, with the idea of booking similar liabilities in similar ways. And you're preventing capital stewardship surprises. What you pull along with that is you're ready for audits, you're ready for acquisitions and divestitures, you're ready for different transaction types, you're ready for different tests of fair value measurement, but you're not doing this because I told you or because an accountant told you. You're doing it because your business desperately needs this. It desperately needs awareness and a good right-sized program that works down future provisions and reserves, has budgets and headcounts, at the right level, not optimistic or pessimistic levels, and you prevent chronic buildup and misevaluation of risks. I've seen programs ramp up with lots of people, crash the headcount back down a few years later, ramp up, and go from feast to famine, feast to famine. It's a tough human cost to watch. What organizations prefer is more of a steady state. Through good times and bad, that there's a relentless prioritization of what projects need to go to the front of the queue, but there's an awareness that there's a backlog, some of it booked, some of it not, and that there's going to be a longer-term need to having a remediation program in place, an asset retirement program in place, and a good justification process for handling the liabilities in a sequence. The importance of a watch list varies from organization to organization. It might be part of what's disclosed if the upper end of the range is disclosed. If there's a major strategic transaction, then absolutely a watch list is going to be an important part of communicating environmental liabilities. Range is essential to explain one key thing: the typical, ordinary, commonplace lack of precision and the lack of comprehensive information. The range does that for you. Putting out a point estimate, say it'll be at least $1 million. We used to do that 20 years ago. Say, okay, it'll be at least this, and then we'll kick the can down the road and revisit this number in 2 years or 4 years or 5 years. And what happens? We always revise the number upward. We always increase our expectation, and we develop a reputation of not having a good initial handle on what are the leading indicators of where a liability is headed. We've gotten smarter, and communicating that improvement in our knowledge and experience comes out in expressing a range. A couple of the other things you'll find that over time, different cost estimators, like your external consultants, your internal project managers, will have different understandings of GAAP. It's entirely normal. The GAAP rules were written by accountants for accountants. They were not written for environmental attorneys, environmental consultants, internal corporate project managers. They weren't. They were written for one discipline talking amongst each other. So again, you'll find that there are opinions about what management wants to know that sometimes are at cross purposes with good capital stewardship, and finding out if there is a systemic bias toward not recognizing a liability or not articulating a risk. We want to find that out, of course, sooner rather than later to put improvements in place or have a sound justification for acting the way an organization is acting. Making sure that triggers are visible, like those recognition benchmarks and obligating events are stated but inconsistently interpreted. That can only come when you start with that process of having a watch list built for a full site, given or written up for a full portfolio, because it's not until that statement is initially drafted that a person can look at what's not recognized and see what time and attention would play out over the years and decades to come. Again, it gives visibility. Finally, external or internal audits may periodically ask for proof that there's some structured judgment behind a watch list number, behind a reserve increase number, showing for a single site, for example, here's 3 different watch lists from the last 3 years. We knew very little 3 years ago, a little bit more 2 years ago. We got a really good break on something last year, and now here's the final number. Showing that progression is only possible if you do have a watch list. Otherwise, you're rebuilding something for 10 to 100 labor hours. You're rebuilding something from emails and presentations. That reconstruction of a watch list ad hoc is probably some of the most expensive activities you ever undertake, because it's got one deadline, it's got one use, and then it becomes instantly stale. That's why, again, I recommend having a watch list in place. Another point of the purpose of the watch list is to kind of signal to people that are new to an environmental liability portfolio about the direction. A watch list helps convey that the answer to environmental liability management isn't spending down the current reserve and turning off the lights, but instead showing that the liability gets spent down and then added back, spent down, added back in a cycle that repeats more or less every year. And articulating the order of magnitude of spending 15% of the reserve balance down and then adding 14 to 18% of it back, that's actually pretty normal. Spending 15% of your reserve balance every year and then adding back more or less 15%, That round trip is actually kind of typical for Fortune 500 companies that have over $25 million of environmental liabilities. We've got a separate topic on 10K disclosures where we do show lots of large famous companies with their remediation numbers going sideways. And that's an important part about showing where a watch list can give a leading indicator of where that's happening so that no one makes any sudden moves like expecting to reassign and shut down a remediation program just as major sites start to come back in that are not known about today, but are discovered 3 to 5 years from now. So it's, again, a watch list is there to help balance the preconceptions that because there's no watch list, our program's wrapping up, we can turn the lights off, get out of that mindset, and you build in the mindset of a watch list is going to be a permanent part of how we're going to grow our business. We're going to take on some liabilities. We're going to find some new liabilities. We're going to be handed some new liabilities, unfortunately. And then we have to have the capacity to prioritize and then manage and then settle those liabilities as efficiently as possible. We have to get better at this, not figure out a way to work ourselves out of a job. In tracking watch lists, one of the things we found is that's useful in visually comparing where a major site may go, and here I've got a very expensive site, is to show how the watch list contrasts with given phases of reserve increases or provision increases over time. And here I've got this sort of a stacked layer of various reserve increases coming up as the top end watch list number keeps sort of generally drifting down. And what I want to communicate with this is that your provision or your reserve, which is the sum of those stacks on the lower right corner, that's your current indicator of your liability. And that generally goes one direction, which is generally, it goes up a few steps every year or 2 or 3, and it just generally keeps accumulating. The watch list is your leading indicator, showing where directionally your total reserve increases are probably going to head. But you also want to be able to show that by doing some special things on a site, like getting deed restrictions, risk-based corrective action in place, buying properties, putting in natural resource easements and so on, that the risks can be tapered off in ways that don't naturally involve a reserve increase per se, but perhaps involve figuring out the end state vision for a given property. When you combine this data with spending, and this will get a little complicated, you'll see that you have the combination of a leading indicator, the watch list, a current indicator, which are the reserve increases, and then the spending, which is the trailing indicator. Spending is the worst indicator of where a liability is going to go, the worst. Here I've got in these green bars here just the cumulative historical spending to show that, yes, the reserve process is working. The reserves are always a little bit bigger than the cumulative spending, which means there is an adequate reserve in place. Okay. But look where the lines of future forecasts are going year after year after year. Sometimes they break through a reserve ceiling that's been set. Sometimes they blow up into the watch list itself. And that's often the long-term trend that you're trying to convey. I know this is busy. I know this is complicated. But through trial and error, we found that this does articulate for your 1 or 2 big sites what the difference is between having a watch list as a leading indicator, where it's all headed, a current indicator like what reserve balance is already set aside and how it got there, and then what the cumulative spending is looking like or stacking up like so far. So if you're interested in deploying watch lists, I just have a hearty recommendation for this type of approach. Number one, I recommend taking a pilot program look at your program and looking at building a pre-recognition watch list for your very next reserve review meeting. You should be able to develop a watch list for 1 or 2 sites within a week. It should take 8 to 16 hours to build your first watch list, and then the learning curve kicks in and becomes much, much easier with smaller sites and less complex issues. But there's a learning curve in there. I recommend taking a look at 3 to 5 active sites and building post-settlement watch lists for 3 to 5 closed sites. Those 6 to 10 sites can give you a sense of what sort of level of effort it would take to do a watch list for a more full portfolio, like a new acquisition target or every site you've ever got contact with or all your Superfund sites. It can give you that framework of knowledge to say, If we did do a watch list for the full portfolio, here we took a 10 to 100 hour toe in the water approach. We took a look at it. Now we want to step back and get endorsement from everybody who's interested in a watch list, like those that handle the company policies, the CFO and controller of the organization. Do they buy into having a leading indicator of environmental liabilities documented, perhaps under privilege, and so on? Next is the legal team, the finance team, the audit team. Are people from those constituencies on board as well? You don't want to be doing this on your own. You don't want to be doing this without endorsement and consensus from the rest of your organization. And you may want to start with things like sharing this webinar or sharing a copy of this presentation with your colleagues to say, this is what some companies seem to be doing. It seems to be a best practice and lesson learned that could add value for us. Let's talk about it. Let's see what you think. And then figure out how to deploy that watch list activity and share the expense among existing reserves. It's I think axiomatic that any sort of program-wide spending, like building a good IT system, building a good purchase accounting system for issuing purchase orders, building a good health and safety plan across all of your field construction sites, just like building a watch list, those overhead items do need to be allocated out among the reserves you've got for individual field work sites. And getting agreement on how to do that, how to set up a charge code in SAP or PeopleSoft or Oracle Financials is, again, part of getting a good buy-in so that the work is funded in the most competent and defensible manner possible. Finally, for rollout, after you do get endorsement, plan on a 24 to 48-month rollout across a larger portfolio. Why not every 12 months? Environmental liabilities don't move that fast. You'll be spinning your wheels on some of these sites and not generating a lot of new knowledge and information. But looking at a third of the portfolio deeply every 36 months, my instinct is that that's a reasonable pace of activity based on how environmental liabilities tend to move in my experience. Your organization may have smaller sites that move much more quickly through processes, or multi-party Superfund sites that move at a much slower pace. So your mileage may vary, of course, but keep in mind as you develop performance metrics, you'll figure out a way to evergreen this type of activity and also figure out what data you do need to compartmentalize and protect under privilege, because not everything is going to be equally shareable or disclosable. So what does a normal calendar item for deployment look like? Generally, you start off in January with a year-end balance confirmation, document those scope changes to the liabilities, which is that column 2 from the watch list. Verify that your obligating events and recognition benchmarks are up to date, which are columns 3 and 4. And then as you go through the year, make sure that those estimates, which are columns 5, 6, and 7, those quantitative values, if you do fill those out, that those are corrected for any prospective reserve increases. Q3 is quiet, normally due to field work here in North America. And then Q4 is a roundup of any major obligating event and recognition benchmark changes for endorsement and booking as liabilities, including especially any new sites that have come into the portfolio. Finally, handling any audit defense and accrual requests and handling budget priorities for next year, important part of any Q4 activity, even January, February activities that we see with our client base. So again, best practices and lessons learned for working with watch lists, focus on those first 4 columns. Don't let the lack of numbers stop you from doing this, because part of this is knowledge management, where we are today versus where we want to be tomorrow or in the years to come. From there, if you feel like the first 4 columns are well articulated, move on to timing, cost range, will it or won't it happen, and then if it's value added, do the correlation step last. Not always necessary, but do it last. The core thing again that you're doing with those first 4 columns is you're daylighting your recognition benchmarks and obligated events. This is where your learning curve is going to be. Not in finding the right number or in assessing the probability of will it happen, but in saying, of those 9 or 12 items that are the recognition benchmarks and obligating events, these have happened, these others have not. So differentiating between the two is what you're making visible. As you deploy, you're going to find that some line items need to get stated a special way. Special way being instead of a number or instead of an explanation, you may put in the phrase contact counsel or omitted for litigation purposes. You may just fill out the cell that way to make sure everyone is on notice that, yes, this tool is here, yes, we take it seriously, but in a specific circumstance, if we're talking perhaps about active litigation, we don't put our cards on the table in some spreadsheet that theoretically anybody can get access to, and talk about things that are going to give away our sensitive bargaining position at a delicate time. Other best practices and lessons learned have come out of discussions about why to do this. So one question that commonly comes up is, how will this effort deliver value? How will a watch list deliver value? We find that lots of budgets target spending to existing reserves, but not for preventing future watch list items from occurring. And I advocate to you that in some cases, with enough planning and the right type of spending and the right sort of mindset, that there could be a multiplier effect on spending dollars to reduce the probability and cost of watch list items. It's way more effective than implementing the best, safest groundwater public treat system or soil excavation project known to man. So again, finding a balance between spending money on currently booked liabilities versus watch list items, that could be a place where some great stories come out over time. And I have some lessons learned to share if you're interested. Next issue that comes up, or lesson learned, who owns the watch list? And that's always the project manager owns their watch list. It's not accounting's job, not CFO's job. I know Sarbanes-Oxley applies to all of us, but it's the project manager that has to own that explanation about where the watch list is and why a liability component isn't ready for booking as a liability today. Third point, is this a privileged document? Yeah, generally speaking, there's an issue with confidentiality, with giving away a bargaining position, with communicating too much to an auditor or an independent observer about speculating a optimistic to catastrophic range of outcomes. In some cases, it's simply not wise, or it's been explained other ways, and having a competing explanation serves no purpose. So and keep in mind, the list can be audited in whole or in part and discussed in summary form. You'll want to have ground rules so that everyone is comfortable with the use of the tool, with who uses it and why, and what goes into it and how it's protected, but that no unripe information or any overly damaging information is simply casually left in a place where it can come to no good end. Who generates the costs and probabilities? Again, usually the people closest to the liability. How often should it be updated? Basically every year if a site is in active negotiations and remediation. Every 3 years seems to be adequate for a site that's gradually moving through the a state or federal remediation program. Particularly a multi-party site, 3 to 5 years might just be fast enough. What are the benefits to watch list deployment? You'll find that by having a better picture of life cycle costs, your cost sharing and cost recovery opportunities go up. In other words, you submit better claims to insurance carriers, you submit better cash out offers to your counterparties for multi-party sites. In other words, numbers that you can live with as opposed to optimistic or short-term mindsets that get proven false over time. The other benefits that come up is knowledge retention, preserving your current thinking about one or more future events. And then first and foremost, that last bullet point there, address your longer term capital stewardship goals. You're going to want to manage your knowledge, manage risks, similar risks in similar ways, set expectations about your budget, headcount, and future provision needs, and prevent chronic buildup and surprises of environmental issues. At any rate, just a heads up, that's the picture that I see for the benefits that we've got going forward. Some of the specific metrics that you might want to look at or point to as goals that you have is that 99% of your reserve increases come from the watch list and the watch list alone. They don't come from unexpected surprises. They come from a place that is given some heads up, some warning to some constituency in your organization. Another good metric I find in experience is over 90% of your watch list items are over 3 years old. They've been bubbling around for a while, and everyone who wanted to look back over the last 1, 2, 3, 4 years can see the progression of more obligating events, more recognition benchmarks, and more and better thinking accumulating over time. Other good metrics that I find is condemning 0 people to visiting the archives or getting an Iron Mountain file set and having to decipher a paper record, making sure that any purchase accounting valuations are good and stable, not just in the first 2-year window after an acquisition closes, but perhaps even for twice as long for the first 4 years. And if there are any failed acquisitions where your organization didn't get the chance to buy an asset with an embedded liability, that you do a look back on who did buy it and see if they got tagged with any surprises. I know that's a little bit of a grave dancer approach to it, but having a look back to say, we're validating our use of the watch list because here's someone who didn't, they overpaid for an acquisition, and now they're looking less efficient in their capital stewardship because of their lack of use of best practices and lessons learned. I'll skip the other two in the interest of time here and move on to our resources to read as we conclude our webinar here today. If you want to get the current version of ASTM literature, I recommend going to the ASTM.org website. Your organization, and perhaps even you, may already have membership and subscription to these standards for free or as part of your membership cost. But again, if you like to buy them each individually, the PDFs are, I think, between $50 and $65 a piece. But your company may already be a subscriber to these already, so it may even be already at zero. If you do want to take a look at the FASB.org website, if they're your accounting domain setters of record, I recommend that these 5 documents, you take a look at that. If they're available for free registration using just your email address on the FASB.org website. Never been easier to get a copy of these. These documents are 20 to 70 pages long each. They're quick reads, but seeing the original language and seeing the original framework written by accountants for accountants, I think has been incredibly useful for me and hopefully will be for you. If you are working for a public agency on the GASB.org domain, GASB 49, GASB 72 on fair value measurement, and the upcoming one, GASB 83, which kicks in later this year, or for some organizations, the 1st of 2019. That'll be a big new type of environmental liability that gets booked for the very first time for your public agency. I recommend getting a look at that right away because it's probably time to start signaling to people that there are going to be $10 to $100 million of new asset retirement obligations to book. And that involves some good news of writing up the assets of your organization and also simultaneously adding an identical liability to the books. I know it sounds a little complicated, but that's actually how asset retirement obligations do work, is you fix your original asset value up at the same time that you're adding your initial asset retirement obligation value on the liability side. It's important to do both concurrently. It's essential to do both concurrently and accurately, and the deadline is fast approaching. Just to sum up, watch lists in our experience have proven to build confidence in the long-term direction of environmental liability management programs, and they do that by improving capital stewardship, by prioritizing relentlessly and continuously how and where to spend money to manage risks, manage liabilities. Also, watch list does help improve compliance with GAAP by showing the bright line between what is and isn't booked today, and retain that institutional knowledge as these slow-moving projects work their way through the study, assessment, design, remediation, and O&M phases. The issues in building a watch list, of course, protecting that data, auditing that data, keeping that data current, and representative of a company's policy, not an individual person's approach to writing up a watch list. In previous deliveries of this webinar, we did a couple of frequently asked questions, and I just want to go over these one more time before we wrap up for today. By the way, if you do have any other questions, feel free to drop them in. I'll do my best to answer them as we wrap up our recording here today. But the first question, why do this now? Number one, it explains the upper end of the range, whether it's just verbally or if you do disclose that. It lets you do a sensitivity analysis about what if you did a policy change. It helps you with cash outs because you're going to be basing liability values and ultimately insurance settlements and PRP cash outs on a fair value, not an optimistic budget or perhaps even a more neutral reserve balance. You're going to want to look at fair value measurement of life cycle cost to close. That's where a watch list kicks in and provides those extra layers over and above what your current reserve is booked at. What should adoption look like? Again, just to sum up, a pilot effort for 3 months, get endorsement, build the right tools, look through what you learned on your first 6 to 10 sites, and then look at converting that eventually within 3 to 5 years to an evergreen effort where more of your time goes to new and closing sites and to new recognition benchmarks and obligating events, and not just simply looking at everything from scratch and documenting things for the first time. There's a good learning curve in there, but the sooner you start, the sooner you'll be making progress from where you were yesterday to where you're going to be tomorrow. It doesn't have to be perfect tomorrow, it just has to be better than yesterday. When's a good time to start? My opinion, 6 months before a big reserve review meeting, when you've got a team meeting, after you get buy-in for a pilot, and after you've got a 2018 goal to manage more knowledge loss, to manage similar liabilities in more consistent ways. Those are good reasons to start and good justification. Should auditors be reviewing this quarter to quarter, year after year? Generally, no. Exceptions for single sites do apply. Look-back valuations after a major acquisition closes, those make sense. But having an outside auditor look at the lack of precision in data, the lack of consistency in analysis, and the lack of aggressive prosecution and closure of environmental liabilities and converting risks into booked liabilities. Environmental liabilities move slow. They don't move at a market pace and a market rate of spending. They each move like snowflakes at their own pace, and they're going to go where they go. And they play out because there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of moving pieces. They're not pensions. They're not product warranty costs. They don't have X times Y times Z, simple, straight financial linearity to them. So again, just leaving this open to consistent regular audits for a first-time user, it could be incredibly disorienting to see dozens and dozens and dozens of moving pieces for a $50 million environmental liability, whereas a pension liability that's $50 million may only have 3 moving pieces, like ending salary, employee tenure, and the current age of the employee. It's a much, much different mathematical exercise. Next, is it useful to publish an aggregate watch list value in a 10K? Perhaps as a leading indicator to really provide a sense that that today's reserve balance is not the end of all work that's ever going to be incurred. It's an important message to deliver that as environmental regulations change, as different environmental laws and regulations are passed, the costs will continue to accumulate, and they're being folded in as a normal part of doing business. What are those triggers to changing watch list valuations? Recognition benchmarks, obligating events. Is consistency among team members a common issue? I laugh a little bit here because, yes, that's often where we come in as the RCI, as we provide training and reinforcement on how to build a watch list, because there's a tendency to just improvise and say, this watch list is due tomorrow, I'll fill it out, I'll check the box, it'll be done, and then it's back to where my comfort zone is. What we try and work on is again having a company way, an agency way of doing things, as opposed to having 5 or 10 different mindsets that lead to again surprises later on. Why is the range important? Finally, to convey that inherent lack of precision of and the lack of current knowledge that you have today. That's normal to not know everything, but to know more than 0, and that's where we all are today. If, again, you're interested in some next steps, you're always welcome to email or call me, especially if you want to talk about these ASTM standards. Again, 15 or 30-minute call. Be happy to answer questions you or your colleagues have about using the standards, discussing what content is in them. Feel free to just call or write anytime. I enjoy this topic. It's not an imposition, and I am looking forward to hearing from you sometime soon. If you're interested in our YouTube page, drop me an email. I'll be glad to send you a copy of the link to it. You can usually find it by going to YouTube and searching for example, asset retirement obligations or environmental liabilities. You'll find our 25-page set of free webinars. You'll find it pretty fast. We're not high no cookies tracking. There's no there's no marketing obligation on your part. Just listen, enjoy, get value out of it as best you can, and keep in touch. With that, I'll end our recording here for today.